Paul.
And it's Megan.
Welcome to the ESPC Property Show. Today we have Mike from Under One Roof. What a great name.
I know. They are a charity who specialise in helping owners and residents of tenement buildings. And I won't go into it too much because Mike does a great job of explaining it himself.
So here we go. Here's the episode.
Cool. So we are back with another episode and we're joined by Mike, who's the Chief Exec at Under One Roof. And we're going to talk all about, well, actually, I'll let you kick us off. Can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and Under One Roof, please, Mike?
Yes, absolutely. Well, great. Thanks for inviting me along. I run a charity. I'm the Chief Executive of Under One Roof Scotland. Now, Under One Roof is Scotland's only charity dedicated to supporting owner-occupiers, landlords, and other housing professionals with tenement management, the organizing of repairs in tenement buildings, the maintenance that's around that, and also retrofit as well. So we're a charity that's existed for about coming up on 3 years now. However, we've existed in sort of a different form for since back in the 90s. So the organization originally was can trace its roots back to a book called The Guide to Tenement Maintenance, which some of your listeners may actually still have a copy kicking around their tenement flat if they still live in one. That book was sort of a combination of work by Annie Flint, who's a community organizer, talking about the management side of things, how to organize repairs, the rules around it, and also John Gilbert, a well-known architect who has since retired from John Gilbert Architects firm, which is still in existence and in Glasgow. And he worked on the maintenance side, and that's a book that has excellent drawings of different parts of a tenement building, but it also goes into a lot of detail about how to organize repairs and the particular rules that existed at the time. Now, those rules consistently changed over the years. The biggest change happened after the founding of when the Scottish Parliament, one of the first pieces of legislation it worked on in those early years was housing legislation. And they came up with, in 2004, the Tenement Act. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but that sort of really changed things and made it clearer how to organize repairs in tenement buildings when the title deeds that people had were silent on an issue. So what happened was, though, is that book also contained a lot of information about grants and legislation. Eventually, you had to print so many updates to it. It just didn't make any sense anymore. And with the emerging technology, it made a lot of sense to move that onto a website. That website is the underoneroof.scot website, which has basically a book's worth of material on it. It's all free, and it provides you that sort of, you can take that particular issue that you've got when you're trying to organize repairs, or you've got questions about various bits of a building, or just something you don't understand, like, well, what is a dormer window or something like that. You can look it up on that website. So that existed for a number of years, and then eventually it was decided sort of to spin out into a charity, a dedicated charity. And so what exists now is a small charity. It's just three of us that cover all of Scotland, and we not only do outreach events. So we in fact we were at an ESPC event just a few months back, actually, late last year, but also in local authorities throughout Scotland. So we were probably in about 20 local authorities last year. We're aiming to try to hit just as many, if not more, this year, working with local authorities, with councils, to put on events, to do outreach, but also webinars. We also have a Ask a Tenement Expert section of our website, so people can submit queries, particularly around their own specific situations. So if they can't find something on the website, and that's not completely, it's completely understandable that they might have something that they might not be able to get out of the website. There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of it can get very tricky and technical when looking at your title. So we have something where people are able to submit queries based on their own experience of what's going on, and then we get back to them, and hopefully within a few days. We've been getting more and more inquiries over the past year on this particular the topic of management, maintenance, and increasingly retrofit. So we try to do as many outreach events and try to get out to as many people as possible, but largely this is it. We're trying to provide the information that already exists, but in a way that people can understand it and point them in the right direction. I mean, we're not We're not professionals in the sense that we don't have qualifications like surveyors, or what we do is we have a real good understanding of what that law is, and we try to get people the best information they can so they can make choices both individually or with other owners in their building about how to go about getting repairs done.
Okay, well, actually, that's probably a good place to start then, isn't it? Because I'm sure there'll be people listening to the show here, living in a tenement property and thinking, okay, we need to do some work on the entire building. So I guess you create an owners association. How do you go about that? I mean,
where do you get started? Where do you get started? It's one of the things that we talk about.
I bet that's the most popular question.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So how on earth do I get started? Well, let's just say, for example, take a scenario where you notice that there is something in your building that needs to be fixed, and it's in some area that you would probably consider a common area, not inside your flat. It would be something, let's say, in the stair, or you notice a very simple one and a very common one would be that you've got plants growing. You can see from the outside you've got plants coming out of your gutters, right? So you've got a blockage in your gutters. You can see greenery coming out of it. It's very, very common kind of repair that you need to be done. And it's on a part of the building, the exterior of the building, that would generally be considered to be sort of common responsibility. So the responsibility of all the owners of the building. So the first thing you would want to do is to talk to your other owners. Now, ideally, you've already got an owners association, but for the most part, a majority, if not most buildings, do not have something that's formally constituted as an owners association. It's not a legal requirement. It will be soon, we believe. So in the next few years, probably the early part of the next Parliament, we're expecting to see legislation from the Scottish Government that will make it mandatory for everyone to take part in an owners association. The current talk right now is that owners associations will just, if you're in a tenement building, and something that's defined as a tenement building, and that's something important to actually note, just as a side note, is when we think about tenement buildings, we think about the old sandstone, the beautiful old sandstone buildings in Edinburgh and Glasgow, up in Aberdeen, the granite. But tenement buildings can be high-rises, they can be 4 blocks, they can be all sorts of different kinds of buildings, legally defined. So that's one thing to just think about, is that if you're in a multi-story building, we generally refer to them as flats. If you're in a flat in Scotland, then you're generally going to be considered to be in a tenement building. So you've got something that you think needs to be addressed. So what you would want to do is talk to your fellow owners, and ideally you would have an owners association. If you don't have one, though, it's one of the first things that we do is really encourage people to form an owners association, a residents association.
Do you have some sort of templates?
We do on our website, and those are, so you can do them very formally. We've got templates as a sort of a model, sort of a bit of a constitution, and you have some sort of, you got officers set up. But to be honest with you, you can be very, very flexible about this. Like I said, the owners association isn't mandatory yet, and so there aren't sort of specific rules set down about how to do it. A WhatsApp group is just as sort of helpful in a lot of ways as having sort of like a regular meeting where you get together in someone's flat and you always discuss things. One of the reasons for that is you've got so many mixed tenure buildings. You've got owner-occupiers in the building, but you've also got landlords that will be responsible for their flats. It won't be the tenants, it'll be the owner, of course, the landlords. Some of those landlords could be living overseas, so they're not going to be able to sort of take part in the normal way we were all sitting around in a living room. And more and more of the cases, it's rarer and rarer to find buildings that are just owner-occupiers. That you've got,
guess within the deed that there may be provision for the roof is the responsibility of the block, or there will be sometimes, not always, but there could be information in.
That is where you want it, and that's the important thing. So once you've gotten together and you've started talking and you've formed, even formally or informally, that owners association, the first thing you want to do is make sure everybody's got a copy of the title deed, because the title deed is the very starting point. Yeah. So I talked about the legislation, the Tenement Act 2004, but what takes precedent over that is your title deed. So, and the title deeds of the other owners in the building. Now, the way it works basically is that if your title deed is either silent on an issue, or it's unworkable, is what we call it, then you refer to the rules set out in the 2004 Tenements Act. And there's, like I said, there's an extensive amount on the act on our website. Title deeds, of course, are different from one building to the next. Sometimes they can be hundreds of years old. It can be very confusing to sort of parse the language. But what you'll often find in there is it will generally identify what are the common areas of the building, and for the most part, that's going to be the roof, the exterior of the building, the stair, the close, and then it gets into the question of, well, does it say something about the back garden or the front area or different pits of the building and stuff like that. So that's one of the first things you're doing, is identifying whether the problem you've identified is something that is the responsibility of all the owners. Sometimes it will be a mutual issue. Those are a good example of that would be if there's a leak or there's a crack in a wall between you and another owner above you or below you. That's something that you and that other owner would work out. That's a mutual repair. And then, of course, there's individual repairs that just you are responsible for. Oftentimes, a good example of that would be windows. Windows tend to be individual responsibility. Where it gets gray is when you talk about dormer windows. So but we won't get into that gray areas, but those are the three areas. So your title deeds is going to sort of lay that out. Oftentimes the two, not always, but it will lay out how the procedure to go ahead with repairs is set out. So you will have, for example, it may say there are 8 flats in this building. Each one of those flats has an equal share, an equal vote. Sometimes it will say you need a majority. Sometimes it will say you will need a majority of everyone that comes to the meeting, and that's really important to note the difference between that. And it'll set a quorum. You need to have at least 3 owners. Those kinds of things. Those are the really things that are really important, because that sets out the procedure about how you're going to go forward with deciding, and then be able to back that up if somebody challenges it legally. Say a absentee landlord that never got in touch or something like that, and goes back and say, well, there was a majority to go forward with this. I owe an equal share of the payment, but you didn't follow the procedure. So you want to always have a paper trail there of some form or another. So it will set those things out. Now, there are a couple of examples, though, that where the title deed is not going to give you the information that you need. One is if it's silent on an issue. So it doesn't tell you what the breakdown is of the shares. It doesn't tell you how many people have to be there at the meeting, or it doesn't, more specifically, it might not say if you need a majority. Or it doesn't set out anything about voting. It will sometimes might be silent on an issue of whether the back garden is a common responsibility or the responsibility of one owner, say the ground floor owner. Another time that you would move on from title deeds and look to the Tenement Act is if they're unworkable. So a good example of this would be, say there was a larger flat in the building, and then 50 years ago it got split into 2 and got developed into 2 separate flats, but not everybody or no one updated the title deeds because it costs money. It costs hundreds of pounds to update your title deeds. Nobody bothered to update the title deeds. So everyone's got a title deed that says 8 owners in the building. In reality, though, there's 9 flats. Now, the maths don't add up. That point, you then turn to the Tenement Act, and the Tenement Act will lay out exactly how that works, how the breakdown would actually be. So I mean, in summing up, though, that is the thing, is first take a look at the title deeds, have everyone check their own. Now, if you're a little bit unsure about it, or you can't get in touch, you don't know where your title deed is, or somebody else doesn't know where theirs is, or you can't get in touch with somebody, these are available on the Land Registry website. So you can download these. I think it's not under £10 or something like that. It's not too expensive, but all title deeds in Scotland are on this site. And so you can get copies that way to make sure that everybody's sort of says the same thing.
Or your solicitor or estate agent would be able
in this
to
case, yes. I
furnish
mean,
it to you.
it's something like that. Your estate agent would definitely have a copy of that.
Do you have any advice on how owners can go about setting up their owners association and broaching this subject with their neighbours? And you mentioned a WhatsApp group. I've got a WhatsApp group in my block, but nothing more formal than that. Is that okay? Or
it is. I mean, like I said, there is no. So owners associations can't be incorporated anyway, right? So when you're actually going to go forward with the repair, it's not the owners association that would sign the contract. It's an individual owner, or probably more likely 2 individual owners. It might be their even bank accounts that everybody's put the money into, and then the money comes out of there. That's important to note because if, for example, you as an owner and the rest of your owners are unhappy with the work being done, for example, and you decided, you know what, we're going to, like you would in any other situation, you withhold the last payment until they actually get the job done right. The contractor will go, if they wanted to go after you, they would go after the individuals that signed the contract, not the owners association. Again, that's something that's going to change, we think, with the advent of mandatory owners associations. But until that time, it's just something it's important to note. But the actual setting up of an organization can be very loose. It can be very formal. There are different ways. One example that, in fact, one thing that we talk about and recommend is a online app called Novaville. Now, Novaville was originally trialed in Edinburgh. It received some funding from the City of Edinburgh Council. It's a private enterprise, but it's a shared repairs app. And it will basically help you from the bit where you communicate to each other. You can all communicate through the app. You can get quotes through the app. It pulls in a lot of information for our website about the rules. You can even set up a bank account actually through there and pay the contractor through that. One of the difficult things you'll find is when you set up an owners association is getting a bank account open. You're essentially talking about having to get a charity account. There are very few banks that do them, and they can be a real pain to actually set up. It's not something that makes banks a lot of money, and so they don't put a lot of time into that. So, and because you're not incorporated, then you can't set up a business account. So that is one way that we recommend actually is people take a look into, because you can use that app. It's basically they get their money if you decide to go through and pick one of the contractors that you get a quote from. I think they add on like 1% or something like that onto the cost. But the amount of time potentially you have saved actually going through it, and they use the Edinburgh Trusted Traders scheme as a sort of a benchmark of where they're actually getting the quotes from. That's something that we recommend that people take a look at and see whether or not that would be something that works for them, because they are expanding out throughout Scotland. I think they've got probably half of Scottish councils now signed up, and they're looking to do more. So you can check out the Novaville website as an example of an alternative way to do it. But you can have, at the same time, I think a lot of it is just knocking on doors and explaining to what the need is. If you come to a flat that's got a tenant, ask for the contact details of the letting agent or the landlord and explain what it is that you've identified and why you're trying to get in touch. And even if you've only got a few owners that are actively sort of involved, you don't need everybody to be actively involved. What you do need, though, is when it comes to, like we talked about with the titles, let's just assume that it doesn't say anything about the voting. We're on to the Tenement Act now. The Tenement Act says that you need a majority of all owners in the building to go ahead with repairs and to collect payment from. Yeah. So a tied vote means you can't go forward with it. If you had a majority of people, everybody came to the meeting, but they were let's say there was 4 people came to the meeting, or even 5 people came to the meeting, they were all in favor of it. The other 5, by not participating, basically negate it. So you need to get a majority of all the owners, where it's really important then that you reach out to them in whatever way you can and try to explain to them the difficulty in doing that. Now, the difficulty that you're having trying to get in touch with them and what it is that you're trying to fix. Now, if there is situations actually about how once you've gone through that process and you've gotten a majority, there may still be owners that
so how you enforce the next stage. Yeah, so you might get a situation, as you say, Mike, where either one or one of your neighbours is either absent or is being difficult, digging their heels in, doesn't really want to participate. I suppose really what you're saying is the guidelines is really what's agreed. Is it the majority or core rate? Or I guess that's how. But even after that, how do you get the money out of that?
How do you enforce? How do you enforce?
Yeah.
How to enforce?
It's all well and good saying, well, it's here in the rule book, but then how do you?
No, enforcing is one of the tricky things. It's the thing that owners will find most difficult is that oftentimes there'll be, hopefully it's just one owner, but it could be more, where the majority have gone and said, yes, we want to fix whatever it is, this thing that we need to fix is, and there's somebody with saying, I'm not going to pay my share. or there's two people that won't want to pay their share, or you can't get in touch of the one or two people. You just don't know. You can get their. You might have a contact address on a title deed. You got to have the title deed, but it could be an old address. People don't update them.
You might get the letting agent.
You might get the letting agent, and the letting agent is just you're just basically having trouble getting the letting agent, or the letting agent is probably trying their best. They're just not hearing back from the landlord. That's not unheard of. So what can you do to enforce that people pay their share? There's a few options you have. One of the better ones you have, because in the Edinburgh area, in the Edinburgh Council. Now this is different for every local authority, so there'll be people throughout the rest of Scotland. This may not be the case. It's important to check with your local authority, but in Edinburgh, for example, they have a missing shares scheme. And this is a situation where the council will step in and pay the missing share for the owner that refuses to pay. So if you put an application out to the council, you say, look, these are we've got it documented, a majority of the owners agreed, one owner won't pay their share, and it fits other criteria. There's some interesting ones in Edinburgh that aren't the case for other places that have missing shares. For example, in Edinburgh, my understanding is that if your building is factored, they won't pay the share. Never been quite sure why that is. That's certainly not the case in a lot of other places that do have a missing share. There's also usually a cost cap. It's usually like there's a minimum and a maximum that the council will be willing to step in. But that's probably your best option, because what will happen is if the council says, yes, we'll go ahead and we'll cover that share, they'll give the Owners Association the share of the funds so you can go ahead with the repair, and they will send a very strongly worded letter to the owner that hasn't paid their share to say, we're paying your share. We are going to charge you this outrageous amount of interest over the period between now and the time that you sell your flat. Now, that could be in 25 years, and that interest could basically eat up any sort of potential profit you would make.
Charge on the flat?
Yeah, they basically put a charge on the flat. Okay. Now, speaking with people that work in Edinburgh's council, in the housing team, a lot of time that does the trick. That does the trick. And you talk to other missing share schemes too. That oftentimes people go. Now, there's also the question, of course, is there's people that won't pay, which we were just talking about. There's also people though that can't pay, and for many different reasons. They may have inherited that flat, and it may be somebody that is elderly and just they don't have the cash. I mean, we're talking roof repairs. You're talking $10,000 and something like per share. So in those situations, we wouldn't recommend something like that, or going down a route of trying to enforce it through legal means, because there's some other legal means that you have. You have something called a notice of potential liability that you can put on a flat. That's something like the missing share scheme, where you basically you put it's not with the same amount as it has something to do with the interest, but basically they have to pay the share, but them and the buyer will have to pay the share of repair when that flat is sold. Now, that's something that'll cost you £60 a year to do it, to register it every year, and you're not going to see the money until that flat gets sold. But that's potentially one way that you can do it. You can also, if it's an emergency repair, you have the ability to use something called simple procedures. It's almost like a small claims court, but you don't need a lawyer to go enforce payment from someone as long as it's under $5,000. If it's over $5,000, you got to go to a different element of the legal system. But if it's an emergency repair, and those are something that doesn't include the support and shelter element of the building, because you also have options there too. So that would be an emergency repair would be like this burst water pipe in the common area. Now, there's something called the duty to maintain, which is on every homeowner in Scotland. They have a duty to maintain, every homeowner in a tenement building. And that duty to maintain is the support and shelter of the buildings. And that would be the roof, the exterior bits that hold up the roof, beams that are, roof beams that are holding it up that might be rotted. You have the ability to use that duty to maintain to get repairs done, even if you don't have a majority. You want to try to, but a good example of that is tree falls through the roof. You don't want to spend a weekend trying to reach everybody in the Owners Association, organize a meeting and a vote and all that. You can go ahead and just organize the repair yourself. And then you will be responsible for collecting the money up, but you'll have the legal backing if you follow the rules that say, look, this was something that needed you. We have a duty to maintain the support and shelter of the building, and that's something that I'm allowed to go ahead and just get a quote, get it fixed, and then collect the payment up. And you have the ability then, you would have to use the other bits I was talking about to sort of chase the payment if somebody didn't want to pay. So those are the different options you would have as far as sort of enforcing payment. But just getting back to what I was saying before, when it comes to someone who can't pay, that's the kind of thing where you're trying to want to work with them. You may set up a payment plan. Oftentimes you'll find in certain situations that the other owners will just cover the cost of that missing share. And that's oftentimes what happens, even if somebody refuses to pay. That's oftentimes like, look, we need to get it done. Yeah. We'll all basically put it in. One other example that it's important to sort of note on this is the issue around if you're in a building that has a commercial property in the bottom. So traditionally, you often find in title deeds, commercial properties will pay a much higher share of the repair. So you can find commercial properties where the deeds will say for the entire building, and you've got that the commercial property on the ground floor, the deeds will say that the commercial property owns 60% of the share. So they would have to pay 60% of the cost of the roof, for example. Now those deeds were written back in a much different economic time, when the shops downstairs were making money. The truth of the matter is tattoo parlors and hairdressers cannot afford 60% of the cost of the roof anymore. And so in those situations, that's something also where you want to look for that same flexibility that you're looking for when you're talking to somebody who is unable to pay. Because in a sense, they are probably going to be unable to pay that too. Keeping in mind that they won't probably own that property, they'll be renting that property from a landlord that owns the actual sort of the commercial bit of it. And it's the rent in their contracts. Oftentimes it's the business that rents that will be responsible for the repairs, but it's the owner of that space that gets the benefit of the capital improvement. So they're basically probably going to say, look, we can't afford to pay it, so we're not going to pay it. Also, we've got 60% of the vote, so we're not, you'll never be able to get it forward without us. Oftentimes in those situations, what we say is, look, just go down there and just offer them, look, even though the deeds all say that 60%, you just do a shared, we'll all share it equally. You might have a worse time convincing the other owners to say, well, my deed says that they owe it, but they're never going to pay it. So you need to be flexible about those kinds of things.
There is good argument. I mean, I listened very intently to what you said there. The idea, and I'd certainly since about 2009 when we started doing these sort of roadshows in the information centre, we spoke about the residents almost getting ahead of the game by having a contingency fund, continuous program of maintenance of buildings, etc., which, as you say, once you set up the residents committee or as you described, that the association, that gets easier to administer, I guess, that you have right, what we're going to do this year, we're going to do this. I remember when I was in the gardens, we had one for our gardens, and we got ahead of the game by getting the tree surgeon in to do things. So we weren't reacting, we were 5-year plan.
Well, you absolutely, and you nailed it right there, reactive. And that is one of the things you're trying to do when you're setting up an owners association. One of the benefits is you're trying to avoid reactive repairs. Mm-hmm. You want to be on top of it. Reactive repairs
and it's cheap.
Always be more expensive. Absolutely right. Always be more expensive. They oftentimes, if it's an emergency, it'll be a patch job because you may not be able to, on an instant's notice, be able to afford the amount of money to properly get it done. So you end up with a patch job just to get it fixed, and then that patch job nobody ever you just move on from it, and it never actually, and then 3 years later you're back to the same problem. Mm-hmm. So you want to be proactive with it. You want to gutters are something that just regularly need to, they're always going to need that. So setting up a process by doing that, setting up with the owners association. Now, if you're in a factor property, that's one thing, because sometimes the responsibility of the factors, and this is important to take a look at the rules and responsibilities of your factor if you have one. And this is something that's interesting to note for your listeners, is that factor properties are much more common in the west coast of Scotland. In Glasgow, most properties are factored, most tenements are. In Edinburgh and the rest of Scotland, most are not.
You got a factory in
So-
yours?
We've got a factory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you do have them. I've been in factory buildings too, but we know from experiences that a lot of people outside of Glasgow have to self-factor. And that basically means that somebody from the Owners Association is just, to an extent, just every 6 months, somebody has a responsibility. Just do a little tour outside the building, get some binoculars out, just take a look and check the gutters. Take pictures of the close and the walls and see whether or not the pictures you took 6 months ago, there's any cracks that weren't there before. Those kinds of things. I mean, it's a little bit more time consuming, and we're very neutral on the idea. If self-factoring works for you, great. If commercial factoring works for you, absolutely, that's fine too. But make sure that there's some sort of factoring in the sense of someone's looking after that building.
Type of thing you do if you had a house, or if you had your own house, you would be walking around doing these things. I think it's just something different when you close your door on the flat. You think it's just your little flat, don't you? But yeah, these things are important. Sorry, Mike.
Absolutely.
Mike, that's been great. Mike, I think we covered pretty much everything we wanted to do today. I think that was great. Lots of good advice.
Absolutely. If anyone has any questions, something like that, please do come to our website. It's free. It's impartial information, and we're always happy to answer questions, and more than happy to come back and chat with you again about this over the coming years.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. All right, so there you go. That was Mike. Very informative, very detailed, but we covered a lot of ground there.
And if you want to find out more about what Mike and the team do at Under One Roof, you can find all the links below in the show notes. But otherwise, we will be back the same time, same place next week.
Different jumper.
Yeah. And yeah, if you are a first-time listener, watcher, please remember to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to the podcast.
But yes, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.